Without further ado, allow me to introduce our speaker this morning, who to this group needs no introduction, Mr. Blaine Mack. He has flown just about everything that's worth flying, and he's going to tell us this morning about the F-86, which some say may be the best airplane that we ever produced. So, Blaine Mack.
First of all, I want to pass on how terrible it is when you have to work with machines that are smarter than you are. Before I start on my program today, I wanted to make a couple of acknowledgments that, at least to me, are very important, and I hope they will be to you too. Last Sunday late, very late, I returned from one of the most moving experiences I've ever gone through in my life. I was honored to go back to Washington, D.C. on the honor flight Southland. And I could spend the rest of the day, it takes longer to tell about it than it did to do it. But I want to tell you this, if you've lost faith in things, you need to go on one of those because it'll renew your faith. We toured, there were, as nearly as I could tell, 138 of us, 69 veterans and 69 what they called guardians, and then of course the crew that was putting it on. And Stan Geil, are you here anywhere? He was supposed to be here. He was my guardian, and he did a superb job, and I'm sure that some of you were involved with him at one time or another. I did not know that until I got back home. But suffice to say, I thank those of you who sent on letters for our mail call. All of this stuff was such a surprise. This ended up being, all of the veterans were World War II veterans. And what they're trying to do is to get the oldest ones first, and they're going to start feeding in the Korean veterans and whatnot. But you tour all of the sites in Washington, D.C., and some of those are just unbelievable. But most of all, I think the welcome that we received everywhere, everywhere we went on a bus, we were escorted by Rolling Thunder. Everywhere when we got off the bus, there were crowds of people around us, thanking us. And when we got off at LAX at the end of the tour, by the time we got out and got our luggage, I don't think there was a dry eye out of all 138 people there. It was a very moving thing, and for those of you who participated in any way, thank you very much. I appreciate it. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Korea with an emphasis on the F-86 because that's the one that I was fortunate enough to fly. And when Kelly introduced it as my favorite airplane, I will take a very small exception to that. It would have been except for one thing, and that was its short range. When well, that was very much the fun side of it. There were times, as all of you 86 pilots out there know, when you sure could have used one more drop tank before you went in there. But what a marvelous piece of equipment. And we're going to talk about what led up to that and some interesting things that have taken place in these many years since then. So we're going to go back and start a little bit on Korea, the forgotten war. And it really was. So let's go back in history just a little bit. I want to read this to you. We've got to go back to World War II to do this. Because, at least in my opinion, the Korean War was Act 2 of World War II. It shouldn't have been. It wasn't planned that way, but that's the way it came out. World War II had been over just slightly less than 5 years when the Korean War broke out. Now, am I doing something wrong here? Okay, let me read this to you. Those of you who spend a lot of time at the Air Museum are very familiar with this, I'm sure. But it is so important. World War II was the greatest military conflict in the history of the world. Excuse me. It was the first war that engulfed every continent on Earth and inflicted more death and destruction on people and nations than any other recorded event. However, the most notable result of World War II, and the very thing that has been ignored by historians and scholars, is that the victors, the nations forced into war by the aggressors, Germany and Japan, in the most compassionate and humanitarian action in history, rebuilt the devastated economies and their political and social structures of their defeated enemies, thus enable them to become the powerful democracies they are today. It should be noted that following all previous wars, the victors ravaged their defeated enemies, taking all their wealth and property, holding executions, and enslaving their population as the spoils of victory. The American people took no spoils or reparations in 1945, but rather assumed a great and heavy burden to ensure that nothing like World War II would ever happen again. And we credit that to Jack Bernabucci, one of the original members of the board at the Palm Springs Air Museum. It seemed that hardly had we gotten home, and most of us gone back to our own way of life and headed where we left off 4 or 5 years prior. And all of a sudden we woke up one morning. Why Sunday? I don't know. It's a favorite of them. But it was June 25th, 1950, and the hordes had come across in Korea. This is what Korea looked like in the old days. It's important to remember that Korea, all of Korea, well, essentially all of Korea, was under the thumb of the Japanese prior to World War II. Very old society. Then on June 25th, this is what happened. And they came across, we had very little. We had left troops everywhere. We had them all over the world. We all know that. To stabilize those countries. What we just talked about with Jack Bernabucci's thing. And all of a sudden, the North Korean hordes came over at the 38th parallel, and you can probably see it right in the dead center there, which was the demarcation. Now, how did we get there? That was a compromise as a part of the surrender, because the Russians had declared war very early against Japanese, 2 days before they surrendered. And so we gave them some of the spoils of war. And that was the mistake, an innocent mistake that any one of us would have made. But it turned out to be a terrible mistake, because those people up north were being sponsored by the Chinese and the Russians. And in no time at all, they had, just in a matter of literally what seemed like days, whatever we had was down here in this little pocket on the Pusan. And that's all we had left. Now, we had, and this is the result. Now this is taken for, if there are any really young people, there's that thing in the background is called a train. And that is an actual picture that could just as well have been a picture at the early part of World War II. Exactly the same. The only difference is that these young people are a little bit younger than the one 5 years prior, or whatever it was, 10 years prior. And immediately, all the reserves were being recalled. People were enlisting like crazy. Why, this was a UN action, but like we all know, all the countries that we had in there, the U.S. led the way, as usual. Well, MacArthur took over, and one of the first things he did was go around and the landing in China. And this is a part of the pre-bombing of the landing in Incheon, and we don't want to go into that in any detail. It takes forever, other than to say that that's what led to the recovery. Now this is where we finally ended up, and more or less are still there today, but not quite to this extent. But as far as the physical layout of the land, there's a 38th parallel, right? A little better than halfway up. And that shows you where our aircraft were stationed during the Korean War, and particularly the latter parts once we got back up after the Incheon landing. And you can see that a lot of that was flowing also out of Japan. This is what it looked like. Now where we lived wasn't quite like this because we were on a slope, so therefore that water drained. Other than that, there's no difference. You can see it's a virtual paradise. And we're thinking about sending out things for people to tour and live in these lovely accommodations. And especially driving those sports cars there. This is what it looked like flying off a carrier. My experience in Korea was that they had two types of weather, really bad and even worse. And it depended, but the reason this picture is here is not just to show you the conditions, but also to show you what they were flying, and that's what we're going to talk about. We had, because World War II, when it was over, everyone knew that we weren't going to have any more wars. Everybody knew that. I knew that. Did you know that? Yeah. So we got rid of virtually everything we had. The Army Air Force, which became the Air Force later, had decided on keeping the 51 as its main fighter. And this was right after the war. So when the Korean War broke out, we went with what we had, because we weren't buying new airplanes, not very many. We were kind of keeping up to date, but not the production that we had before. And this is one of the very early shots of them on a ramp over there. I'm not sure where this is, but it's clear down in the southern tip, at any rate. And as I said, the Marines were flying F-4Us, and that wonderful little workhorse right there, that still was even more famous in Vietnam. But look at what it's carrying underneath it. And one of our very newest ones, which was the F-82, the twin Mustang, which even though the 51 had very, very good range, this one was even better. And we had a few of those, but not very many. And now we're starting to usher in the jet age over there. Now we're a little Johnny-come-lately on this, but that, of course, is the P-80. Our first, I hesitate to use the word, but I will anyway, first frontline jet fighter. And it was a good airplane, but was severely handicapped. And then we brought in some F-84s. And this is one of the earlier models. Nearly as I can make out, it's an E, but I'm not sure about that. But at any rate, and that became, for a brief while, the frontline fighter bomber there, because the F-80 was having some real problems there. And as good an airplane as it was. And this shows you what the Navy was doing. Now we're ushering in the jet age, and for the first time that I know of in the history of aviation, we're in aerial combat in jet aircraft. And one other thing that has been a lifesaver worldwide that came in almost exactly, actually these came in at the tail end of World War II, but then they were never, to the best of my knowledge, used in combat theaters because they came out too late for that. But they did in Korea and of course in Vietnam, the choppers. Now this shows you what started out as their job? What's the first thing they gotta do? They gotta get these hordes back where they belong, which is north of the 38th. The first thing you have to do is cut off communications. You have to shut off any kind of transportation, supplies, any of those things. Cut them off, and they can't go anywhere. And this, of course, flying out of Japan, a lot of B-29s, which very quickly became vulnerable to attack. And which brings about number 2 job of the U.S. and the Naval Air Force. Here we have a picture of what came out very quickly thereafter, which is a MiG-15. The MiG-15 was a good airplane, Russian aircraft, and it took us a while to figure this out, and I'll never understand why. There wasn't North Koreans flying those things at all. They were almost exclusively Russian. Good airplane, very high altitude, higher altitude than higher ceiling than any of ours at that particular time. Followed quickly thereafter by the MiG-17. These presented a serious problem to everything that we had up to that point. And here again, we go back to this line, and you can see it. If you look clear over there in the left-hand corner, you find where the Russians were flying out of. So that's the lay of the land of what we had in place at that time. And then came the F-86. There are not enough words of praise as far as I'm concerned for that marvelous airplane. The only reason I say that it was not my all-time favorite airplane is because, as every 86 pilot out there will vouch for, it had the weakness of not having enough range. And you could get into trouble because you didn't have enough fuel to finish the job. So sometimes you had to bite your lip and head for home. And I gotta stop at this point because it's right there. I won't tell you where or who, because I don't want to get out there. But a couple of years ago, I was at an air show. And the Red Bull MiG-17 went by. Nice, sensational flyby. And the announcer, with the thing turned up as loud as it would go, says, and this is the MiG-17. When the F-86 pilots saw this thing coming, they headed for home. Well, you know, sometimes you get tired of having your tail stepped on. So I went up and I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, hey, I got a question for you. If the 86 pilots headed for home when they saw those things, how did they manage to get a 10.5 to 1 kill ratio over them? I don't think he ever used that phrase again. Marvelous airplane, and a lot of you out there are 86 pilots, and I think you'll agree with me. This shows you without the tanks, which we never flew except on the way back, and even then you tried not to if you didn't have to. If you weren't actually going to get into hot stuff, you left them on there because you were going to need them. And there's what they look like with the tanks on it. And this is more or less the markings, and I'm not sure because I don't know this particular one, what outfit that is. That's typical markings of the F-86 in Korea. And that may very well, if that's not an actual picture of them, it's a very good imitation of it. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit. And this is a picture that almost all of you have seen at one time or another that really tells the story. Up in that upper left-hand corner there, up near where the aircraft were, the North Korean, supposedly, aircraft were located, was an area they called Big Alley. And that was So this, I think, is Tegu, but I'm not sure. It looks like it. But at any rate, that shows guys going out there, I guess, so they can run away from the big 17s. And this shows you Joe McConnell in the center there, who was the first Korean War ace, being congratulated by some of his friends. And you notice the stars up above. So this is that's a funny looking guy there. And hey, somebody dyed my hair. And that was my airplane right there. And that was named after our oldest daughter. And so this is the kind of thing that was done so much. A lot of the work. We spent a lot of time talking about the MiGs and the 86s in particular, dogfight militia and whatnot, and that's terribly important because that does say who rules the roost. But the real thing is that the support of the people on the ground. And you know, I haven't found too many guys that will disagree with me on these things, that they had it a lot tougher than we did. Because they could never get away from it, and we could. So, and another thing that, and we talked about this on this trip a little bit, it was a chance to get together with guys of all different areas and talk about things that they never talked about before. And one of the things that I said to several of them was that one of the greatest fears of any ground support crew is not that they miss the target, but the fear of dropping on their own people. And there were times when we would think about that for a long time, and we're always relieved when we found out, fortunately, that we never had. In this case here, it's a little different because you're moving out of the train. You can see your target, and when you're supporting ground troops, it's a whole different ballgame. And one of the things that, in spite of all of this stuff, and we used to see all USO shows, and I never once got to see Bob Hope overseas. I did hear a couple of times, but not overseas. But this is taken in very early in the Korean War, and there's our friend Bob Hope right there in the middle of them. And of course, we all appreciated the efforts there. One of the things, MacArthur, of course, was in charge of all of this. And I often wondered, and I've heard a lot of other people say the same thing, what it was to drive him, that drove him to run us clear on up, clear to the north, where we were a threat at the Yalu. Because to me, it made a whole lot more sense to just run up to the foot of the mountains and say, oh, hey, that's far enough, you can have that. Nothing grows up there. You don't even get anything to heat your stoves with. You can have that. We'll take this right here. As it was, at least they could perceive it as a threat to China, and they did it. They were more than happy to jump on that right away. And part of that resulted in what we refer to as the frozen chosen fiasco, where it was bad. We lost a lot of people there, and would have lost a whole lot more except for some very brave B-26 pilots and some of their escorts. We had a few of them. Unfortunately, I think they may be all gone now. That's the ravages of old age taking their toll on them too. I hope not all of them are gone. I think there's still one of them locally that flew those missions. Extremely dangerous missions. They're at night, they're up in the mountains, they can't see anything. I don't know how they kept from losing more than they did, but they were helping those guys out of the frozen chosen, the Marines that were trapped up there. And they did get most of them out. Not all of them by any means, but most of them. These guys, if there were any real air heroes in Korea, I take my hat off to these guys right here. That shows a fun thing there. It's broad daylight, the sun's out, and all. I don't think they knew what it was like to see the sun. And this is kind of it kind of tells a lot of story. This, of course, is in Washington, D.C., and the Korean Memorial, and I have another one. That's this one here that I took last Saturday. I did, and you can see the leaves are turning. And I put this one in there for one reason. The other one doesn't show clearly one thing. Look at the one on the far right, and if you study that carefully, each one of these is doing a different thing, and he's looking back. Why is he looking back? To make sure there's nobody coming up there. That's the story, that's what the intent. These are the guys coming out of the frozen chosen. That's what the chosen reservoir up there. So, I'm going to, at this point here, go back and talk now about the F-86 and what it was like. I've kind of I've been blessed, I think, when it comes to airplanes, because I have had the privilege of flying some of the finest aircraft ever built. And for that, I've been very grateful. I've only flown 2 aircraft that I really didn't care for out of all of them. As I said, the F-86 would have been my favorite if it had they'd had a little more range capability. Sometimes that worked to your advantage. The 38, it was just the opposite. You sat on that cylinder to inflate your life raft until you had welts on your rear end, and for 8 or 10 hours. Maybe that wasn't so good either, I don't know. But at any rate, the first time I got in an F-86 was in Korea. Went over there and checked out there, and off you go into the wild blue. You know, if you could find the end of the runway, you were qualified. By the time I had the gear up and locked, I said, boy, this is a marvelous piece of equipment. I will give it the greatest compliment I can give to an airplane. It flies the way an airplane's supposed to fly. Other than the range, I don't know the weakness. It was kind of ballyhooed as a supersonic aircraft, and it was if you were headed down steep enough with full power. But it would go through the Mack, and the only thing you noticed was the stick would tend to shake to the right just one notch, and then it was over. Oh, I just went through the Mack. You look at the Mack meter, and sure enough, you had. And then when you go out the back side, it did the other. What caused that, I never found out, but I never cared either. So, and they were bothered to look. So, this was an aircraft that we actually had in our inventory prior to the Korean War, but nobody cared. The war was over. We were never going to have any more wars. As I said before, everybody knew that. You knew that, didn't you? Yeah, sure. It's a good lesson for us nowadays. But there's one thing about it that, along with several hundred items I could name, one of the things I like about the U.S. and the American people, when push comes to shove, they're going to come through. And we used to say in World War II, and it didn't quite apply this way in the Korean War, because we didn't have quite that big a need for it. But I was always grateful that I flew aircraft designed by American engineers and built by American women, because they were the very best. And I think most of you from World War II, if you give it some thought, will agree with that. Well, that also was the case to some extent during the Korean War. It was kind of interesting as all of this began to develop, how rapidly everything reverted back to World War II. It was as though we had taken a recess, an intermission, so to speak, and that's exactly what it was. Are we doing that today? I think so. But we'll have to wait and see what's going on. But there is one thing about it. Without the F-86, and it wasn't the only one, but it was the prime one, I think, we would have far more difficulty in the Korean War than what we had. The pilots were typical American pilots. Cocky. I want to go to a party at the club. But if you really insist on a fight, you came to the right place. And how many times you sit on the end of the runway in a little shack somewhere, and you got this 2x4 radio sitting there, and you're sitting alert with flight of 2, flight of 4, whatever it happens to be. And that phone rings, one guy runs for the phone and the other runs for their airplane. No questions asked. None at all. If you can take off a formation, that's what you do. If you can't, you do what you can. And when you get to about the time the gear comes up and locks, and guy squawks on the radio and he's telling you where to go. And it was a great comfort to know that strapped all around you was the best fighter in the world. And when you went into that battle, you may not have quite the ceiling that the MiGs had, but you didn't care about that. Because what ceiling you had, you could get to a whole lot faster than they could. And if you could get them down to yours, which you always could, then you had all the advantage. But you had another advantage. Even though these were flown by Russians, almost exclusively, we found out later. We suspected all the time they were flown by Russians, but not to that degree. But they were trained by Russian instructors, not American instructors. And they were flying Russian aircraft, not an F-86. So that when they're going into the fight, they may have thought they had the advantage. Coming out the other side, they did very well, they didn't. And so, you know, I guess some of what I'm talking about today was renewed this past weekend as we got into this honor flight thing and listen to people talk. Not just people in the air, actually there weren't that many of us. Most of them were ground, or a lot of them Navy, a lot of Marines, and they all had the same story to tell. In this particular case, many of the guys, being World War II veterans, had also been in Korea. So they had the same kind of stories to talk about. In fact, some of what I'm telling you came from some of them. Excuse me. In my mind, I will always have a soft spot for the F-86, just like I do the P-38, because when push came to shove, they were going to bring me home. And I was going to get to look at them and maybe put a little more floor wax on them one more wartime. And so with that, I'd kind of like to open it up for any questions that people might, anybody might have concerning the activities of the Korean War. It was a war quite unlike anything else, and I'm grateful for that. Oh, one other thing I did forget to mention when I'm talking about the B-29s, I forgot to mention that they were working exclusively out of Japan, of course, right, as far as I know, for the entire war. We started out working our aircraft, the ones that Army or the Air Force aircraft out of southern Japan until we got that Busan perimeter extended to where we could get at the airfields. And as all of you know, they're still fighting that battle today. And one interesting thing, I looked this up to make sure I was right. Kim Jong-un, who is now threatening the U.S. And I thought, how appropriately named, Un, because he's about as as anybody I've ever heard of. But the sad part of that is it's crazy people like that start problems. It's not the Khrushchevs who will push you right up against the wall, but when you come back at him, he's going to say, oh, I didn't really mean that, and go back home, because he doesn't want to get hurt. This guy's nuts. So at any rate, that's where we are today. And with the Korean War, we set the stage for Vietnam later on, as far as the air war is concerned, because we had then crossed that line from the prop age to the jet age. And incidentally, people that haven't done this, I explained to them my first experience with a jet aircraft, and it was a T-33, of course, and I sat down in the front seat there, and the instructor was on the wing, and I said, where's the rest of it? And he said, that's all you get. You can't fly with only just a stick and a flat lever. And that's all they give you. They could work. Because actually, for those of you who are back to the old prop days, you know that it was really far more difficult to fly those things than it is a jet, which is what makes the jet so much better. And the F-86 had, that was about as close to a trouble-free aircraft as I've ever really been around. We would come in, I got struck by lightning once, and it hit right on that little nose peak where the radar is. The way we found it was when we opened the doors, everything was round. And that aircraft never stuttered, kept right on going. Marvelous, marvelous piece of equipment.